Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Jones. I'm the Executive Director of the Harkin Institute for Public Policy and Citizen Engagement at Drake University. And we're thrilled to have this opportunity to partner with the Zero Project and the National Center on Disability and Journalism to welcome Amanda Morris and learn more about her experience as the New York Times' first ever Disability Reporting Fellow, and to learn more about the 2022 fellowship. Before we get started, I want to make sure that everyone knows that we do have ASL interpretation occurring. We'll have a couple of interpreters who will be switching off. There's live captioning available as well. And if at any point you have questions for the panelists, particularly for Amanda's, where we're going to go with most of our Q&A, please add that in the chat. Here at the Harkin Institute, our work in disability is driven by the story of Senator Tom Harkin, who was the lead sponsor of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And in our work, we focus on research having to do with persons with disabilities, along with many other policy issues. But in our disability work, we focus a lot of attention on employment. And that work surrounds every industry or any disability, and wanting to make sure that we are pushing for the goal of the Harkin Challenge, which is to double the rate of employment for people with disabilities around the world. We do that through our Harkin Summits that are held annually, and also through working with partners from around the globe who are also equally dedicated to the employment of people with disabilities in meaningful work, not in menial tasks. And that's doubly important when it comes to journalism and news coverage. We know that representation within newsrooms is so important to what gets covered and whose stories get told. It's encouraging to see news organizations making a more deliberate effort to increase diversity within their newsrooms and to recognize that you cannot truly be diverse without including disability in that definition. We're grateful to the National Center on Disability and Journalism and Kristin Gilger for their work to increase representation and opportunities for employees with disabilities, and to all of you for taking the time to join us today. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Kristin Gilger, Director of the National Center on Disability and Journalism and Associate Dean of the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. Kristin.
Hi, I'm Kristin. I have been at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University for about the past 16 years. And during almost all of that time, have headed the National Center on Disability and Journalism at the Cronkite School. We're going to do real quick introductions here, and then we'll really launch into our conversation. I want to pass it to Michael Fembek for a quick introduction. Michael.
Thank you, Kristin. My name is Michael Fembek. I'm the director of the Zero Project. The Zero Project is a project ongoing for 10 years that has been started by a small, but I would say smart Austrian foundation. And in these 10 years, we have developed a special research approach, researching innovations and good practices that support the implementation of the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We have researched more than 700 of them. And by doing that, we developed a network of, I would say, a few thousand people that are part of the Zero Project network. And this is a network of people who are inspiring, who have been carefully selected and groomed because they're doing something out of the ordinary. And they are fully intrinsically motivated because everyone taking part in the Zero Project network does this for free. So we don't pay anyone anything, even not the awardees, to be part of the Zero Project network. So this is a really inspiring, connecting, encouraging network. And I'm also having a personal interest in this topic of journalism. In the first half of my career, I was a business journalist in let's say, an Austrian version of Forbes or something like that. And I think the Zero Project is also a lot of storytelling and about research and analytics. And we are happy to make this connection. As you can see here, we are a catalyst of so many great organizations, and we could be helpful also in bringing this great group together here. So with that, over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Michael. Good afternoon, good evening, or maybe even good morning, depending on where you are and where you're tuning in from. My name is Nick Swyter. I'm a program manager for philanthropic partnerships at the New York Times. Our mission is to build stronger, more just societies using the power of great journalism funded by philanthropy in partnership with nonprofits. One of the projects that we're working on is this Disability Journalism Fellowship that we're all here to learn more about. And with that, I'd like to introduce our Disability Journalism Fellow, Amanda Morris. So please, I invite you to introduce yourself, Amanda.
My mute button's being spazzy today, but thanks, Nick. I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm so happy to be talking to all of you about this fellowship, which I am literally currently in the New York Times building completing. And I am going to be very excited to answer everybody's questions. I will be talking more about my fellowship later, but so far I'm about halfway through, and I've got another 6 or 7 months to go.
Amanda, tell us a little bit about your journalism background, because this is not the first time you've done journalism.
Yeah, so before this fellowship, I was most recently working at the Arizona Republic as a science reporter. And I've previously worked at the AP in North Carolina covering politics, CNN in DC covering politics and world news, and NPR in DC covering national news, as well as some internships at the Hartford Courant, the country's longest continuously published paper, one of the oldest, and the Republican American, which is a local newspaper in Connecticut.
It's interesting because Amanda was in Phoenix, Arizona, as she said, at the Arizona Republic. I used to work at the Arizona Republic during my newspaper career, and we were in town at the Cronkite schools in Phoenix, but we've never actually met in person because by the time we got this set up, she was already headed to New York. So I only know Amanda as a virtual friend. But it's good to see you, Amanda. I want to take just a minute or two to talk about the NCDJ and sort of how this all got started, this fellowship program with the New York Times, and then turn it over to Nick, who's going to talk much more specifically about the application process and how the fellowship works. So about the NCDJ is a non-advocacy organization that really works to help journalists and communications professionals around the world do a better job of covering and depicting disabilities and people with disabilities. So we do that in a number of ways. One of them being this fellowship program, but we also provide a very popular disability language style guide that helps people sort of navigate language around disability, which changes quickly, which can be problematic for a lot of people. So that's available on our website at ncdj.org. And then we also provide training and resources. We're active on social media. We try to share a lot of good work around disability, including Amanda's work. And we sponsor an international contest each year that recognizes the best reporting on disability around the world. It actually started out as around the US, and we got so many inquiries around the world about being able to enter the contest that we've opened it up. And we do see a lot of interest internationally now, I think, in this topic and in doing better in this area. So about a year and a half ago, I got a call from one of Nick's colleagues at the New York Times saying, you know, we have this fellowship program, and our fellows are assigned to different beats. They cover different areas for the New York Times, and we've been thinking about trying to do a fellowship that really focuses on disability reporting, because the New York Times, like many news organizations, recognize that we need to do both more and better when it comes to reporting on disability. And I said, I think that sounds like a great idea. And we ended up going in together for a grant with a grant proposal to the Ford Foundation. And the NCDJ and the New York Times have both worked with Ford Foundation in the past. If you're not familiar with what they do, they have a a strong dedication to improving not just coverage of disabilities, but the status of people with disabilities in society. So we put in a grant proposal and it was approved as a 2-year grant to put a full-time reporting fellow, someone who is early to mid-career at the New York Times, to really, really focus on this area. First time ever that this has happened. I will say that since the fellowship started, I've had a number of inquiries from other news organizations interested in doing the same thing, which I take as a very encouraging sign, right? That nonprofits and for-profit newsrooms recognize that this is a really important undercovered area, and we're exploring options with other news organizations to do the same kind of thing. So that kind of just gives you the background of how we got started with all of this. And then I will ask Nick to jump in to talk a little bit about the application process and how the fellowship works. I will say we had a lot of applications last time, and the New York Times ends up choosing, it's their choice, their employee, they choose the fellow, but asked me and the NCDJ for input. And so I reviewed all of the applications, and Amanda was the clear front runner, of course, and we were unanimous in our agreement that Amanda would be the best inaugural fellow in this important program. So Nick, maybe you could talk a little bit about how this works.
Sure. Thank you, Kristin. So yeah, this is as Kristin mentioned, this is a 1-year fellow. Amanda is the first one, so she's going through the program right now. The next 1-year fellowship will start in June 2022 and run until May 2023. As Kristin mentioned, it's a grant-funded position supported by the Ford Foundation. And this fellow will report to the New York Times National Desk to report on issues that are relevant and important to the 19% of people in this country who live with a disability. While this fellow will work primarily with the National Desk, because this is a topic that cuts through every part of life, there's plenty of opportunities to work across the organization with different journalists, depending on what the story requires. This fellow will also belong to a cohort of about 30 other fellows, and they'll participate in a program that includes training, speaking opportunities, and also just a peer network, because it's good to have those peers right now where you are in your career, and especially down the line as well. In addition to the core parts of the fellowship program, the fellow also receives some additional mentorship from NCDJ. So once again, thank you, Kristin, for that support, as well as some journalists who have done more groundbreaking investigations that are important and relevant to people with disabilities. Things to know about the actual application. So we're currently receiving applications, and those are due by 5 p.m. Eastern time, US obviously, on December 1st. And I can leave once I'm done speaking, I'll leave a link to that application in the chat. This role is for early career journalists and career pivoters. So we're looking for candidates who have some internship experience or equivalent experience. And lastly, I should mention that this is a role that this role is only for people who are authorized to work in the United States. And then just a few other notes about the actual application. We're looking for about 5 clips and a cover letter. We encourage you to include clips that are relevant to this topic and really speak to us about why you're interested in covering this topic, either for personal reasons or different experiences you've had in your life. So with that, thank you so much, Kristin. I'll pass it back to you, and I'll put the actual link in the chat.
Yeah, Nick, let's talk just for a minute.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Let's talk for just a minute about the importance of what we're looking for here in terms of someone who understands disability. So when we reviewed applications, we really are looking closely at, someone who has experienced disability, who has lived with disability in their family in some way, because we feel like that's an important perspective to bring to the newsroom. So anybody can apply, and a lot of people had amazing statements about how they care about this issue and what their experiences have been with this issue. But I did want to bring that up because it is something that we consider.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, lived experience, we see that as an asset. We believe that lived experience is going to assist with the actual reporting of this topic, and is going to have give perspectives that are valuable that typically have been overlooked in journalism as a field. So we're excited that this fellowship will really emphasize that.
Great. All right. So the star of the show, we're going to speak with Amanda here for a few minutes. Amanda, first talk about what you bring in terms of your own experience with disability to this fellowship.
Yeah, sure. So I will love to, I would like to talk later about why I think this fellowship is the best one. Of course, I'm biased, but I think what I bring to this fellowship with my experiences is an element of critical thinking. And that's what's going to make you successful in this fellowship, in any of these fellowships, and in any job you do in journalism. Success isn't necessarily measured in, how many stories have I ever produced. It's measured in the quality of the stories and the approach you take to your reporting. And essentially, I consider it a success every time I pitch a story that my editors are like, oh, we never thought about that. Or, oh, like if you weren't here, we probably wouldn't be covering that. And that's exactly why this fellowship exists. It's so that these fellows can bring new ideas and new perspectives into the newsroom. So I think one of the critical elements when you're thinking about your application is how can you bring like a new approach and a careful look at disability, because that's what we're looking for, right? We're looking at improving coverage of disabilities and bringing different types of narratives to the table and different types of stories to the table that might have gone unnoticed or missed otherwise, because everybody here is obviously very busy. So I hope that helps answer the question.
Well, what is it? Talk about your lived experience and what, how that informs your reporting, your experience with disability, and how that informs your reporting.
Yeah, sure. So I remember very distinctly when I was applying for this, I wrote in my cover letter about a story that I had done at my time at NPR, where there was a Starbucks that had just opened, and it was a signing Starbucks. And it was basically like, a lot of fanfare around this Starbucks being accessible to the deaf community, which was Gallaudet University, which is like a public university, like specifically like aimed towards deaf students. And I saw this and I was like, like I think the story is bigger than just, oh, Starbucks opened a signing Starbucks. And I decided to pitch a story that went into unemployment within the deaf community. Because when I went to the signing Starbucks myself, I noticed that one of the baristas had a master's degree in education. And I found myself being like, why is he a barista, right? Like, obviously, like if he wants to be a barista, he can. But I knew based on my parents' experiences that it can be really hard to get a job when you have a disability. I know that based on like years of my parents struggling to get jobs and like, frankly, like experiencing discrimination in that process. So I wanted to do a story that dug into, the Starbucks is hiring, deaf people to be baristas, but like, what is it like for deaf people to get jobs throughout the organization and throughout like other companies? And, what does this mean in terms of like a bigger picture? And I think that's, what made me successful as an applicant is thinking about the bigger picture, because the New York Times, if you've ever read a New York Times story, they're always so much more like big picture and critical thinking than I think like some outlets might be. And I think as I've gone through this role, it's really served me well to have that lived experience, because I've come up with pitches that I wouldn't have come up with, I don't think, if I hadn't just literally been thinking, yeah, well, this is different for me, right? Like, I think if you don't think about it every day, it might be really hard to know what it's like to live with a disability. And you might not think of it when you see wildfires happening in California to go, okay, like that's going to create a problem for somebody with a disability, right? And those are stories that I've been able to cover during my time here.
Great. We have it. And I wanted to mention, if anyone has questions, comments, you can use chat or Q&A. It's fine. I'll look at both of them. There is a question for Nick about, will you consider remote fellowship candidates if their disability requires them to, and I just lost it, requires them to be remote. And then I want to, after you answer, Nick, I want to go back to Amanda to talk about, you started this fellowship remotely. So what were those challenges? Go ahead, Nick.
Unfortunately, I don't have a firm answer. My general inclination is that it would be considered, just because like the last 2 cycles have been remote, but unfortunately, I don't have a firm answer on that.
Yeah, we'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
And if you, whoever asked that, it was anonymous, if you could send me, and you could do it as a private message, your email, I'll try to get the answer to that for you after the session. Amanda, back to you, and then I'm going to stop like interfering here. So you talk about how the remote experience, but then just tell us what it's been like and the kinds of, to be a fellow at the Disability Reporting Fellow at the Times, and maybe talk about some of the stories that you've done.
Yes, yeah. So I think starting any job is always a roller coaster, and this was actually my first time starting a job remotely. So I'm actually in the office now, if you can see behind me, which I'm actually very happy to be. Like, I know there's different camps of people who do or don't want to go into the office, but I think the hardest part about starting remote, and this is just something to know about the New York Times, it's a really big place. And the benefit of being in the office is that you can bump into people and introduce yourself and just get a better sense of how the newsroom works by being here. But I don't think that starting remote has hindered like anybody too much. Like I still think this opportunity has been incredible. And of course, all the other fellows also started remote. So we were all kind of in it together. I will say, no matter which fellowship you do on this, like, if you get a fellowship, no matter which fellowship you do at the New York Times, you will learn so much. Like, I think one of the best things about this fellowship is how much I've been able to learn from the time I started to now, which is, it's crazy to think that it's only been 6 months, but it's fundamentally changed how I approach my reporting, period. Like, it's changed how I write, it's changed how I interview, and it's changed how I pitch. It's changed everything. And I don't think you have to be an expert on disability to start. Like, I obviously have a disability. I grew up with a disability. I have disabled parents. I don't think I was an expert when I started. I actually think one of my favorite parts about this has been the journey that I've had throughout the last 6 months of being able to like delve into this topic more. I don't think anybody was gonna like shortchange you if you aren't already an expert, because I do think there are not a lot of opportunities to report on disabilities in newsrooms. Like, there's not a lot of disability reporting roles, right? So like the chance to be on this full time and to focus on disability full time is incredible. Like, I've always been interested in disability and I've reported on disability in the past, like when stories have come up, but to be able to really immerse yourself in it is a completely different story, because you get a better sense of like what's going on, like in a broader scope. And I think it's unique from the other fellowships in that sense that you have this beat, and anybody who reports on a beat will tell you sometimes it takes a couple months, sometimes it takes a year just to master a beat. And there's something so different about beat reporting versus general reporting. You really develop a better sense of expertise on beat reporting that you can use throughout like your career. And I think disability reporting is a really useful topic to gain experience in. I also think it's a very fun topic to report because, like Nick said, you get to work across the newsroom. So I started on the national desk, and the first couple months, I think I was really just trying to figure out my beat and figure out how the national desk worked, and that's totally normal. Like, I don't think anybody should come in feeling like they have to have it all figured out from day one. I think you should come in with the ideas. I think you should come in enthusiastic, and I think you should come in with critical thinking. But I think it's okay to learn while you're here. That's the whole purpose of the fellowship. And as I've gone on, I've learned a lot about how my desk worked, and now I'm really starting to work a lot with other desks. So to give you an example, this week I am currently working on stories with the travel desk, the culture desk, and my own desk. And then I know that in the future I will also be reporting a story for the sports desk in a couple weeks, and I will probably end up writing another story for the science desk soon because I love science and I've worked with them a couple times already, and they're a fantastic desk to work with. So unlike some of the other fellows, like you really have this room to play. You get to pitch to other desks, and you get to meet so many more people because of that. And you get to like just explore so many different topics that interest you. Like the hardest part about this job so far has been that I am only one person, and there are so many ideas and stories to the point where I know that I cannot cover them all. So I really have to prioritize what stories I'm working on, which days. But I really think it's unique from the other fellowships in that sense. And that's my favorite part about it. But then because it's unique from the other fellowships and that it's a beat, I think, like I said, you really have to come in with like ideas and be ready to pitch. Other fellows do pitch their own stories, but their experience is a little different from the get-go in that they sometimes get assigned stories more often than I might, just because I'm so new. And part of the exciting thing about being part of a new role is that you get to help shape it, right? Nobody quite knows exactly what it's going to look like by the end of the year or what on my portfolio is going to look like by the end of the year. But because of that, I get a lot of I feel empowered to, help shape how I think this beat should look and what stories I think we should be covering and how I think we should be covering them in a way that I think is like when else are you going to get this kind of opportunity to do this at a place like the New York Times? Like, I think if you're not sure you have the expertise or whatever, like I would still encourage everybody to apply because this opportunity is incredible. But definitely make sure that you come in ready to pitch and ready to do your own research and be a self-starter. That's probably the biggest skill that I think you need to be successful in this. And I think it helped me that I was reporting on science, specifically bioscience, at the Arizona Republic before this, because I was actually the first bioscience reporter at the Arizona Republic. So I had already a notion of what it was like to start something completely new in a newsroom. And it can be challenging, but it can be so rewarding. Like, I can't tell you how many emails I've gotten from readers that have thanked me for like covering stories in a different way or covering stories that they don't think would have been covered otherwise. And it just makes all the hard work I've put in really feel like worthwhile.
So Amanda, we have a question about there's so many disability stories. How do you figure out which ones you're going to cover? And maybe you could give us some examples of that.
Yeah, so again, this goes back to your critical thinking skills. So I think I started out in this role, the first couple of stories I did, I know that they, this is a training program. So they wanted me to start initially with a few like smaller stories just to get the hang of how things work, which is definitely like important because, I think I came in with a lot of big ideas. I still have big ideas, but now I feel like I have a better understanding of how things work so that I know how to sell my ideas and pitch them. So yeah, it's hard. I think the first couple of weeks I got hundreds of emails, and I've been slowly sorting through and creating a cataloging system for my emails. But I got so many pitches and ideas, and I think how to know which stories rise to the level of like a New York Times, that's something that people who work at the New York Times for 10 years will tell you. That's one of the hardest parts of pitching is figuring out what makes a New York Times story. So what I'll say is the New York Times is national, right? So you want to be thinking about stories that have resonance with our audience across the country. And this is like very different than reporting local news. Obviously, if you're submitting clips and you've got a great disability story that's local news, like I don't think you should hesitate to include that in your application. But when you get here, it's about taking those local stories and figuring out what the national trends are. So it's almost like, I've told my partner this many times, it's almost like crafting a thesis every time you write a story. Like, what does this mean? And it like brings me back to being in college and writing like very like high level essays. And obviously there's room for fun stories. Not every story has to be serious and like feel like a college essay. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's more that, can you take a local story and can you see a broader trend or a broader importance in it? Or can you see a bunch of things happening and connect the dots and say, oh, wait, there's a story here, right? So when I'm thinking about pitching a story to my editor, usually the things I ask myself are, why would somebody read this? Why would somebody care? Who are the characters? And like, what are their stories? And those are the other critical elements of pitching a story, is that if you have a story that's really deep in the weeds, it's going to be hard to read, right? Like, the best articles and the best stories we publish have impact, and they have impact because they are stories. People remember them. And I think my favorite stories to read are the ones that you can relate to, right? So when you're thinking about who your characters are, the best stories and the most successful stories, I think, find characters that, you know, when you write their story out in an article, it's going to feel like almost like a treat to read, right? So that, I hope that answers the question. But basically, I always tell people, if you're trying to pitch to me, like, why is it important, and who are the people I care about?
Right. Michael, your hand is raised.
Yeah, thank you. So being, as mentioned before, a former journalist, I'm having hundreds of questions, but I will also only ask two of them. So Amanda, one question would be, from my experience, people who write stories also see the success in getting direct feedback from your peers, from your friends, from emails, from chats, whatever, from your colleagues. And if you, I'm assuming you're doing the same thing, but if you're using this measure, what was your most successful and most relevant article that you wrote, and which was a more disappointing one where you might have expected more feedback?
Yeah, it's a hard question. Like, it kind of goes back to, like, do you give the audience what they want, or do you give them spinach, right? Which, that's very jargony, but basically it's this idea of like, I don't want to, it's hard to explain, but essentially, I think no matter if a story does well or not, I think all the stories I've been reporting over the past year are still important, because the way that I've framed them and the way that I've written them are just examples of how to cover disability well, right? So like, I think in and of themselves, all the stories have value, but in terms of measuring story success, it really depends. Like, I don't think we can solely go off of how many clicks it gets. Obviously, we see that, and we can see, you know, where a lot of people clicking on the story, were they engaged in the story, how long did they stay on the story and read it. I try not to worry too much about that, because sometimes super deep investigations get less clicks than like a train crash, right? And I can't control what the audience is going to do all the time. All I can control is how I approach stories and what I report on. And so the other ways that we can measure impact are, did it cause something to change, right? Like, did somebody in power resign, or did like a company change the way it does things, or whatever. And then the third way we measure impact, I think, is like the feedback I get. Like, I get emails from readers, we see comments on stories. I get a lot of comments and retweets and messages on social media, and people sharing the articles and things. And I think like the articles that I've written, by and large, have been well received by the disability community, but have also sparked conversations and interest outside of the disability community. And that's a success to me. So it's a really
any specific examples of something that just produced a response that you were very pleased with, or that didn't produce the kind of response you expected? Any specific examples of stories?
Yeah, I just opened on my email. I have a folder called Sunshine, and it's just where I put all my favorite reader feedback. So I think two stories that really garnered a lot of like response and were successful. One was a story in which I reported on college students going through remote learning. And there had been a lot of stories throughout the pandemic about students struggling during remote learning, which is true. And I reported a story on that as well. But disability is not a monolith. And I think the best stories can recognize that. So I had pitched doing a story not just on the students that were struggling, but on the students that were thriving during remote learning. So I ended up interviewing a number of students who talked about remote learning and talked about how they want to see a broader shift in society to allow for remote options. And if you've been at all connected with the disability community in the last 2 years since COVID happened, that's really come to the forefront because of COVID. The idea that remote access to work or learning is an accessibility issue, right? So that story got a lot of responses. Like, I mean, I got like an article that was like slow clap and like it's. I don't want to like read too much of the reader feedback, but because I don't want to, I guess, overly pat myself on the back. But I do like when readers write to me like, "Oh, I really like the way you covered this," or "Thank you for writing about this." Another example is when I wrote about children under the age of 12 who were high risk because of medical conditions or because of their disabilities, and basically their parents pleading for people to get vaccinated. And it all came out of the fact that one morning on Twitter, I logged on and I saw somebody that I followed, because I follow a lot of disabled people on Twitter, who and parents and organizations, who tweeted that her son, who is high risk, disabled with medical conditions, had gotten COVID, and it was like her worst fear and nightmare. And she was like just putting out all these tweets, like begging people to get vaccinated. And I think a lot of the COVID discourse at that point was, oh, well, you know, if you're still getting sick, that's because you didn't get vaccinated. And that's, you know, like, to sum up other people's words, like there was an attitude of like, if you're getting sick, that's like your responsibility because you chose not to get vaccinated. And I think that very much the blind spot in those people's arguments was children who could not have gotten vaccinated because it wasn't approved yet, and particularly children who are high risk, because the other argument was that children are not at risk for COVID. So I was looking at this subset population that had kind of been ignored by public discourse. And in writing that story, I got so many responses from parents being like, thank you for writing this. Like, and they were saying like, I felt like this whole pandemic, people weren't considering us. And that's the point of this fellowship, is to consider people who might otherwise not be considered because of people's internalized blind spots.
Yeah, I think those are great examples, Amanda, because it is about, you know, the old adage about giving voice to the voiceless. So we have two other questions I want to throw out there. Shelley asks if you have met other people with disabilities at the New York Times. Is it an environment where people with disabilities are welcomed as colleagues?
I've definitely felt welcomed, and I've actually been very happy about the timing of this, because right when I started, or right before I started, the New York Times actually has an ERG, an employee resource group for people with disabilities, that formed right before I started. And it's been such a great community of people that I don't think I could have figured out everything at the beginning without them. Like, they've offered so much support and allyship, and they're all so happy to see a disability reporting fellow at the company. So I've never felt like a lack of, I know that there's people supporting me in the newsroom, right? So, and then the other thing that I've happily discovered is that there are a few editors, like, I don't feel like I should name them, and I think that would be uncomfortable, but there are a few people, I should say, at the New York Times who identify as having a disability, who reached out to me, who work in the newsroom, and they have let me know, like, if I ever need anything, or if I ever have questions about an article I'm writing, like they're happy to be there as a resource, because my editors are great, but there are sometimes times where I turn to other people with disabilities to ask them, like, am I explaining this concept correctly to my editors? Or like, is this coming across the way I want it to? Because editing can be such a back and forth process that you want to make sure that if you're trying to tell your editor, like, this is why I think we should write this way, that you can explain it in a way that your editor is going to understand. So I definitely feel like I've been welcomed. Like, even from the get-go, my first week, my editors asked me, like, is there any accommodations you need or anything you want us to know in order for you to do this fellowship successfully? And I've never been asked that question by an employer before, of like, hey, is there anything you want us to know or anything we can do? I've usually had to go and be like, hey, I need this. So it was really nice actually to have the tables turned like that. And I think the New York Times is really invested in seeing this coverage succeed, you know? So.
Right. And I think Joseph has sort of a related question about the experience at the Times. Joseph?
I do. Thanks, Kristin. Amanda, tell me about what kind of feedback you've gotten when you pitch stories. Have you gotten people who are really eager to say, yeah, we want to do that? Or have you gotten some pushback on some of the things that you suggested? What's that part of the experience been like?
Yeah, so I think it's natural to get pushback. Everybody gets pushback no matter what your beat is, right? Like if you cover religion or science, like not every story you pitch is going to be accepted, right? And that's always sucky when that happens if you really believe in the story. But I do think that, people are willing to listen if you want to make an argument for the story. So yeah, I guess not every story I've pitched has been accepted. I'm trying to figure out how to like explain why or what happened in every case, because some of the stories that I pitched, I think I'm going to repitch when the time is right. So I don't necessarily want to give away my story ideas. But essentially for pitching, it's just about like knowing what the parameters are and knowing kind of what's also big in the news cycle right now. So like when I first started, like Britney Spears was really big in the news cycle, and there's an angle to conservatorships and guardianships that has a lot to do with people with disabilities, because that's who most conservatorships and guardianships apply to, right? So that pitch was very easily accepted because we already knew that it was drumming up some interest. So sometimes it's a matter of how can I take things that are in the public eye and point out the disability angle, right? So like another example of that is climate change and wildfires. All summer, my desk was very preoccupied with wildfires in California. And I was like, okay, well, people are really interested in wildfire news right now. This is a good opportunity for me to pitch this wildfire and disability story. So like, I don't think every story, like, I think pitches can be timed, right? Like, it's hard to do every story right away. So like, I thought about prioritizing my stories based on what the news cycles were like. And that's just going to help your stories get more readership in general. And it's kind of like a gateway for people to not even know that they're, reading this disability reporter's story on disability. They think they're like clicking on like this climate desk like webpage and they're interested in wildfires, and then they're like, oh wait, there's a disability story here. I've never thought about that. So like, it's a good way of capturing an audience that might not otherwise click on disability stories.
Well, and that helps me with wanting to ask you the next question, which is a follow-up to that, which is how do you continue to cover stories, especially stories that are positive for people with disabilities without them becoming inspiration porn? And how do you talk to your colleagues about that, in terms of how they cover things? What have you heard or experienced in that realm in regard?
Yeah, Joseph, and we had a Cronkite student who's on who asked a very similar question about how do you avoid inspiration porn? And Amanda, maybe start with your definition of what that is.
Yeah, so not everybody's familiar with inspiration porn. So inspiration porn is a term coined by the disability community and disability advocates to describe essentially coverage of people with disabilities meant to be inspiring to those without disabilities. And it really serves to kind of gloss over the real lived experiences of those with disabilities. So some examples of this are like when you see stories of baby hears for the first time after a baby gets a cochlear implant or a hearing aid if a baby is born deaf, that shouldn't rise to the level of news coverage unless it's literally the first cochlear implant ever invented, right? And if we're only covering it because we think it's we're gonna cry when we watch this video of this baby hearing, I don't think that's news, right? So news is important, it's impactful, it's new, and it's got human interest, and it's not, you know, something that happens every day. So inspiration porn is often times when something that is actually ordinary gets covered as if it's extraordinary, right?
Because it involves somebody with a disability.
Because it involves somebody with a disability, right? So other examples of this could include like student with a disability walks across the stage for graduation, and it's just like almost painful to watch these videos of like this, like it's just a graduation, but then like local news is covering this one student as if what he did is so like spectacular because he or she or they looks or acts like somebody without a disability. So like the other kind of way that I screen for is this inspiration porn is, do we think this is a news story because we're excited that somebody with a disability looks or acts or sounds like somebody without a disability? Are we trying to create this narrative that it's amazing when somebody with a disability behaves like somebody without a disability? Because that's kind of a framework that assumes that not having a disability is better than having a disability. And a lot of people with disabilities would tell you that they're proud of their disabilities and that they wouldn't want to give them up. Like I'm one of those people. I like that I have a hearing loss. It's a pain in the butt sometimes, but it's more because of the way society has responded to it. It's not because
It's
of like
it's part of who you are, and has made you who you are in some ways.
I wouldn't I wouldn't do a lot of things if I didn't have a hearing loss, I don't think. So the way that I avoid it and the way that I recognize it. So essentially like a story that I reported was about, like one example of a story I reported that could have gone into inspiration porn territory, but didn't, was a story that I wrote about people with disabilities doing research to try to go to space for the first time. And there was a lot of people that I interviewed who were basically going on an airplane flight that simulates zero gravity by going like up and down. And in lunar gravity, which is about 1/3 or 1/6 of Earth's, I forget, one of the people who uses a wheelchair told me that he was able to stand up for the first time in his own. And another person actually told me the exact same thing. So two people who use wheelchairs told me that. And even one of them like kind of told me that in a way that could have very easily been disability inspiration porn. He was like, oh, I was finally able to see eye to eye with people and I felt like a human. And, you know, he said all this stuff and I kind of made a decision right then and there that that wasn't what I was going to quote him on and it wasn't what I was going to focus on. Because I didn't want to make it seem like seeing eye to eye with somebody is what makes you human, right? Even if that's how we felt, like I'm not delegitimizing that, but essentially like the story was not about people standing up for the first time. The story was about how there have been barriers to space and barriers to becoming astronauts for people with disabilities for decades based on no real research, and how these people with disabilities were trying to do research to prove that it was safe for them to go to space. So I took that moment because I still think it was a really important moment for the story, and I changed it and I focused on things that both people also told me about how they thought it could have therapeutic applications. So could we do, physical therapy in reduced gravity environments? Or could this allow people with disabilities to have greater mobility in reduced gravity environments? And like, what implications could that have both on Earth and in space? And that's like a much more interesting and more newsworthy story than somebody stood up, right?
And you use the standing up in your story, but that wasn't the focus of the story. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So sometimes a story, if you report on it, could or could not be inspiration porn depending on the angle. Like, I'm not saying we shouldn't cover Paralympians doing awesome things in their sports, but it's about how you cover Paralympians doing awesome things in their sports. Are you covering it from like oh my gosh, this person is running even though they are an amputee? Because that would be inspiration porn. Or is it, hey, this person kicked butt in their event and they took first place and they won all these gold medals in the Paralympics for the United States? That's a story, right? So.
No, that's a great answer. I really like how you frame that, Amanda. There's a couple other questions. One, how much do you incorporate solutions journalism into your reporting? That comes from Jody Hawson. So I don't know if you use solutions journalism, Amanda. I don't know that we've talked about that.
It's a really good question. So I think journalists by nature are skeptics. It's not that we don't want solutions for the world's problems. It's that it's our job to think about it critically, right? Again, goes back to critical thinking is one of the most important skills for this job. So I've definitely reported stories. Like I'm reporting a story now on a technology that's being implemented in airports that's supposed to help people with hearing loss. And I'm approaching it skeptically. And I actually think having a hearing loss makes me even better at approaching it skeptically, because I can think about all the different ways in which it would or would not be useful for me if I was going through an airport, right? And there's a lot of people who do pitch me every day being like, this treatment or this technology will solve the problems of people with this disability, right? And I do think it's important to be skeptical about that, because a lot of technology and a lot of like medical research is not actually done by people with disabilities. So it's not always going to solve all the problems, right? An example is wheelchairs that go upstairs. People often think that this is really cool. It is cool that somebody invented it, I guess, but those types of wheelchairs are really expensive, and people who use wheelchairs actually don't use those types of wheelchairs because they literally can't afford them. So, and it's a lot easier for buildings to put in ramps, right? So when you're thinking about solutions-based storytelling, it's important to think about, does this solve all the problems? Does this actually solve a problem? What are some of the caveats? What are some of the drawbacks? And basically like examine it critically. Like, I think it's easy for people to get overly excited about solutions for people with disabilities without actually understanding what the impacts are going to be on people with disabilities. So again, this kind of goes back to a very common phrase that I repeated in a lot of these types of panels. Don't do a story about disability without talking to somebody with a disability. So
yeah, which is a really important point we haven't mentioned yet. One of the things we really encourage journalists to do is to don't just talk to caregivers or family members or medical experts, talk to the people with the disability. Jody, we do a lot of solutions journalism at the Cronkite School, and your question is really a good one, and I'm going to think about that more in relationship to coverage of disabilities. So thank you for the question. One more question, and then I'm going to turn it back to Joseph for a wrap. There is a little conversation going on in chat about use of the term disabled or disability at all. So, there's one point of view, like, why do we even use the term disabled? Why don't we say a person who lives with muscular dystrophy or whatever the diagnosis might be? And then another point of view is that many people within the disability community embrace the use of that word. That's an identity that they're proud of. So, and Michael, you might want to jump in on this too, because I'm not sure what that conversation sounds like, in your part of the world. But Joseph and Amanda, anybody who wants to jump in on that question about the use of the actual term disabled or disability. Michael?
Yeah, this is, I think, one of the most discussed points in everywhere you go. And we learned that it's the easiest thing to do is just stick to the wording of the UN Convention and use those terms. And all these experts and academic and other really informed papers that are really directly related to the UN Convention, then you're on safe ground. Even with using some terms like psychosocial disabilities or intellectual learning difficulties, all of them have some pros and cons. So it's a tricky terrain. The UK uses disabled much easier than the US does. So there's a lot of cultural differences that are very interesting to discuss. But my question is always, does it help the cause if we engage in this kind of discussions? Sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. So having said that, a remark, I really found this final point of Amanda, that there is a kind of dilemma between being critical and solution journalism. This was my biggest food for thought for today, because we are, as the Zero Project, of course, fully into solution-driven reporting and storytelling, and we also think ourselves being critical. So this is really something that I will take home for further thinking.
Yeah, Jody makes a really good comment in chat about, as it goes back to what Amanda was saying about including the voices of people with disabilities in your reporting, which is to ask the person who you're talking to how they prefer to be referred to. Do they want to be called a person with a disability or living with a disability, a disabled person? Do they prefer people first or identity first language? How do they describe their experience living with their disability? And I do think that because language can be different from country to country. Does impairment mean the same thing in the United States as it does in Italy, for example, as indicated in the chat? That it's really important to ask people how they want to be identified. Amanda, any thoughts on that? And then I will give it back to Joseph to wrap us up.
Yeah, so again, ask people how they want to identify, and then also I like to be specific about how they use, how, not just do they prefer person first or disability first, but how do they describe their own disability? So within hearing loss, right? Some people say I'm hard of hearing. Some people say I have a moderate hearing loss. Some people like there's all these different kind of terms, or hearing impaired, right? Like there's different terms that people like to use. So that's another best practice. And then it's interesting because I've actually gotten mail from readers sometimes being like, loved your story, but you shouldn't call them disabled people. You should call them people with disabilities or whatever the case may be. And I always respond like, actually, I've talked to XYZ person and this is how they've chosen to identify. So it's interesting because it's not just been a question of like, how do you handle sources, but like, how do you handle reader responses on that? And I think that there's a lot more awareness of this happening now.
Very good. Joseph, back to you.
Thanks, Kristin. And thank you, Amanda, for your work and your reporting and for sharing your stories and experiences with us today. So vitally important. And I'm glad that you have enjoyed what you've been doing, which it looks like and sounds like in your voice. So I'm happy to hear that, and I'm looking forward to what appears next. I'd also like to thank Michael and Kristin and Nick for being a part of this conversation and making this opportunity available for others to be able to see and hear about Amanda's experience. So the Zero Project and the National Center on Disability and Journalism pulling this all together, which has been really great. And for anybody who has been watching or listening, this will be put out on the Harkin Institute's website this afternoon. So the recording will be up and available, and you can feel free to share it with others as you see fit. Want to make sure we spread this information far and wide, and continue to connect on this really vital conversation, but also the idea that the coverage that occurs because of folks in positions to make these sorts of stories available to the reader and to the world is really important to continue on. So I appreciate everyone's time this afternoon and look forward to visiting with you soon in the future. So thank you and take care.
Very good. Thank you, Joseph.